A certain kind of intelligence doesn't show up on any test, was never taught in any school, and almost nobody who carries it actually asked for it. It got forged in rooms where the air changed before anyone said a word, in silences that hid more than they revealed, in patterns that kept repeating until they finally got seen. Some people walk through life reading what's underneath every conversation, sensing the fear behind someone else's anger, the wound behind someone else's control, long before they ever learn to turn that same gaze toward themselves. Others discover, usually much later than they'd like, that the chaos they survived once is exactly what built the strange calm they carry now, the kind of stillness that makes everyone around them wonder how they're not falling apart. This isn't a list of pleasant traits. Think of it more like a map of what pain leaves behind when it isn't wasted, the architecture quietly built inside a person who had no choice but to adapt, to watch closer, to feel deeper, to navigate without anyone handing them a way forward. And here's the part most people never get told. Some of what feels like a curse in the body, the hypervigilance, the inability to fully relax in a room, the sense of always standing slightly outside your own life, watching it happen, can become something else entirely, once it's finally understood instead of just endured. By the end of this, you'll likely recognize parts of your own story inside more than one of these signs, and you'll start to see why what once made you feel different, harder to read, harder to settle, was never actually a flaw. It was a form of intelligence the world simply doesn't have a name for yet. Stay until the end, because the last piece of this is the one that changes everything that came before it. She walked into the room and felt it before she understood it. Nothing had moved. Nothing had been said. Yet something in the air had shifted, like a temperature drop no thermometer could measure. The conversation around her continued exactly as it had a moment ago, laughter still hanging in the same easy rhythm, but inside her, something had already changed gears. This is the strange opening note of a kind of intelligence that was never chosen, never studied, never earned through books or classrooms. It was built the way a callus is built, through friction, through repetition, through nights that asked more of a person than they were ready to give. And here is the first thing worth sitting with. This isn't a metaphor for sensitivity. It's closer to a recalibration of the nervous system itself, one that happened so early or so often that the person never noticed the moment it began. Most people call this intuition and leave it there, unexamined, as if it were a gift handed down at birth. But if you trace it back far enough, you'll often find a very different origin story. You'll find a child who had to read a parent's footsteps to know which version of the evening was coming. You'll find an adult who learned, cell by cell, that comfort could disappear without warning, so the body built a radar system just in case. That's the foundation. Not magic. Adaptation, what makes this form of perception so easy to miss, is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't look like genius. It looks like a quiet unease in a room that everyone else calls normal. It looks like noticing a friend's tone shift 3 seconds before the friend notices it themselves. People who carry this trait often spend years assuming everyone else feels the same static, sees the same flickers, picks up on the same undercurrents. It takes a long time, sometimes decades, to realize that this isn't the baseline for most people. It's a specific kind of awareness, sharpened on something painful, and most of the world simply never had to develop it. Think about a smoke detector installed, not because the house was particularly fire-prone, but because there was already one fire, once, that nobody saw coming. After that, the device gets more sensitive, not less. It starts picking up smoke from a candle 3 rooms away. That oversensitivity used to look like a flaw in machines designed for safety, but in a human being, it can mature into something else entirely, a perceptual instrument tuned by necessity rather than choice. The shadow side of every difficult chapter, it turns out, often comes bundled with a sharpened set of eyes. If you want a concrete way to test this in your own life, pay attention the next time you walk into any shared space, a family dinner, a work meeting, a friend's apartment. Don't think. Just notice. Did you clock the mood before anyone spoke? Did your body register a tension that hadn't been named yet? Write it down, even just one line in your notes app, every time this happens for a week. You'll start collecting evidence of a pattern that's been running quietly in the background of your whole life. This isn't about diagnosing yourself with anything. It's about recognizing a skill that was forged under pressure and giving it a name. Because unnamed things tend to feel like burdens, while named things can start to feel like tools. The wound that created this awareness doesn't have to stay a wound forever. There's a reason ancient traditions, from the desert mystics to the old contemplatives, treated suffering not as something to erase, but as something to read, like a strange handwriting that, once translated, says more about the structure of reality than comfort ever could. And this is where the deeper layer starts to open up, the layer most people never get invited into. Because what you're really looking at, underneath all of this, is consciousness expanding in response to threat, then refusing to fully contract back down once the threat passes. The nervous system doesn't simply forget what it learned to survive. It keeps the upgrade. And somewhere inside that upgrade is the seed of something Carl Jung spent his whole life circling. The idea that what nearly destroys a person can become, if it's met, honestly, the very material out of which a larger self gets built. Not instantly. Not without cost. But the architecture is already there, waiting. The question that starts to surface now, the one worth carrying into everything that follows, is what happens when this same radar, the one tuned to danger in a room, turns inward. What happens when it starts reading not just other people's shifting moods, but the quiet, unspoken parts of your own mind that you've never had the stillness to actually look at. Long before a single thought ever formed in words, the body was already keeping score. This is the part almost nobody talks about when they describe people who seem to just know when something's wrong. It didn't start in the mind. It started lower, in the gut, in the chest, in the small muscles around the eyes that tighten a fraction of a second before the brain catches up. Think about how a newborn doesn't reason its way into safety. It simply feels the difference between being held steady and being held by someone whose own heartbeat is racing. That's where this story actually begins. Not in childhood memories you can narrate, but in a layer of experience that predates language entirely. The body becomes the first translator of danger, the original interpreter, fluent in a vocabulary made of tension, posture, and the rhythm of someone else's breathing. And once that translator is built, it rarely retires. It just keeps working quietly underneath every adult interaction that follows, scanning, comparing, flagging anything that resembles an old familiar shape of threat. This is why so many people with this kind of wiring describe feeling exhausted in rooms where, on paper, nothing happened. No one raised their voice. No one said anything cruel. And yet their shoulders are up by their ears, their jaw is tight, their stomach has quietly knotted itself into something resembling dread. That's not an overreaction. That's a body running an old survival program on a new piece of data, treating a raised eyebrow or a slightly clipped tone the way it once had to treat something genuinely dangerous. A useful practice here, one worth actually trying tonight, is a simple body scan before bed. Lie down, close your eyes, and slowly move your attention from your feet to your scalp, just noticing where tension is sitting without trying to fix it yet. Apps like Insight Timer or even a 5-minute guided scan on YouTube can walk you through this if silence feels too loud at first. The goal isn't relaxation. Not yet. The goal is simply mapping the terrain, learning where your particular body decided long ago that vigilance had to live. There's an old image from alchemy that fits here surprisingly well, the idea of the prima materia, the raw, unrefined matter that has to be worked before it can become anything of value. The body's early hypervigilance is exactly that kind of raw material. Unrefined, reactive, often inconvenient in a modern world that doesn't actually contain the same dangers it was built for. But raw material isn't waste. It's simply waiting for a process. Somatic practices, things like Peter Levine's somatic experiencing, or even slow, deliberate breathwork, exist precisely to take this ancient wordless vigilance and give it a chance to finish what it started, instead of running on a loop forever. The body wasn't wrong to learn what it learned. It was responding accurately to its environment. The work now isn't to shame that response or override it with willpower, but to slowly teach the nervous system that the danger it's still scanning for has, in most rooms now, actually passed. What's strange, and worth sitting with for a moment, is that this entire process happens in a part of the self that has no access to calendars or clocks. The body doesn't know it's been 10 years since that house, that relationship, that version of childhood. It only knows patterns, and patterns don't expire on their own. This is why intellectual insight alone, just understanding intellectually that you're safe now, so rarely calms the system down by itself. Something has to happen at the level where the original learning occurred. And this is precisely the doorway into a much older idea, one that shows up across nearly every contemplative tradition in different clothing, that the unconscious doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks in sensation, in image, in the tightening of a particular muscle at a particular moment. Which raises the real question waiting just ahead, the one that turns this from a story about survival into a story about depth. If the body has been listening, translating, and reacting all this time without asking permission from the conscious mind, what else has it been picking up on that the mind has never been invited to hear? Most conversations are read on the surface, word following word, sentence answering sentence, like a transaction that closes the moment both people stop talking. But there's another layer running underneath every exchange, one built not from what gets said, but from what consistently doesn't. A question that gets answered with a story instead of an answer. A topic that always, somehow, finds a way to drift somewhere else. A silence that lands in exactly the spot where an explanation should have been. People who've lived through enough instability tend to develop an ear for this second layer, almost without trying. The way a sailor develops an ear for the particular silence right before a storm changes direction. They're not analyzing every sentence on purpose. They're simply noticing, the way you'd notice a missing stair in a house you've walked through 100 times. And once you start noticing absence as its own kind of information, you can't really unnotice it again. Here's where this deepens into something more specific and more useful. Inconsistency between words and actions creates the exact same kind of gap as a missing answer, just dressed differently. Someone says I'm not upset while their voice has gone flat and their eyes have gone somewhere else entirely. Someone promises something will change, and it doesn't, and then doesn't again, and the explanation each time sounds reasonable enough on its own, but stops making sense once you line all the explanations up side by side. This is the terrain where gaslighting and blame shifting tend to live, not as dramatic, obvious manipulation, but as a slow, repeated redirection of attention away from the actual issue and onto something more convenient for the other person. A practical habit worth building here. Start keeping a private note just for yourself. Whenever a conversation leaves you feeling confused about something that should have been simple, write down what was said, what happened afterward, and whether the two actually matched. Patterns that are invisible in a single moment become impossible to ignore across 10 entries. There's a reason the old stories return again and again to figures who could see clearly but weren't believed. Prophetic figures, oracles, the ones standing just outside the room shouting about a fire nobody else could smell yet. Their tragedy was never a lack of sight. It was that everyone around them kept listening only to the words on the surface, while ignoring the unmistakable shape of what those words were avoiding. People with this kind of perceptual training often feel like a quieter, less mythic version of that same story, sensing the gap long before anyone else is willing to name it, and learning, slowly, painfully, to trust that sense, even when it isn't immediately confirmed. This is also where patience starts to matter in a way most people underestimate. The instinct, especially in a culture addicted to quick resolution, is to fill an ambiguous silence with the first explanation available, just to make the discomfort stop. But the deeper skill, the one this kind of awareness eventually builds, is the ability to sit inside an unanswered question without rushing to close it, letting more information arrive before deciding what the silence actually meant. What starts to become clear, the longer you live inside this kind of attentiveness, is that the unconscious mind, both your own and other people's, almost always leaks through the cracks rather than walking through the front door. It shows up in the pause before a lie, in the over-explanation that follows a half-truth, in the topic that gets changed 3 times in a single conversation. Carl Jung spent years pointing at exactly this phenomenon, the idea that whatever gets pushed out of conscious awareness doesn't simply vanish, it reroutes itself into gesture, tone, and gap. Which means every conversation carries 2 scripts running simultaneously, the one being spoken aloud, and the one being revealed by everything that's conspicuously missing. And once you can read both, a much more uncomfortable question starts to surface, the kind that turns this outward-facing skill back towards something closer to home. If you can spot the gap between what someone says and what they're actually protecting, can you spot that same gap in yourself, in the stories you tell about your own behavior? The moment that behavior starts coming from somewhere you'd rather not look at directly? Topic 4. When you see the wound behind someone's behavior, there's an old story, half myth, half memory, about a wounded healer, a figure who carries an injury that never fully closes, yet somehow that very injury becomes the instrument through which they understand pain in others. Chiron, in the old Greek telling, was a centaur who healed everyone around him while living with a wound of his own that medicine couldn't touch. It's a strange image at first, the idea that the very thing left open inside you could become the precise tool you use to read what's open inside someone else. But spend enough time around people, really watching rather than just reacting, and that old image starts making a different kind of sense. The person who explodes over something small isn't actually reacting to the small thing. The person who needs to control every detail of a plan isn't really driven by the plan itself. Underneath almost every outsized reaction is something being protected, something that learned long ago it couldn't survive being touched directly, so it built a much louder defense instead. This is where perception starts doing something almost uncomfortable. It stops letting you see people as simply difficult or too much or dramatic, and starts showing you the architecture underneath those labels. Anger, looked at closely enough, is so often fear wearing a louder costume. Control, looked at closely enough, is so often the echo of a moment when nothing was controllable at all. This doesn't mean every difficult behavior deserves a free pass. That's a different conversation entirely. But it does mean the behavior stops being the whole story. A practical way to build this muscle: the next time someone reacts in a way that feels disproportionate to what's actually happening, try silently asking one question before responding. What does this person feel like they're about to lose right now? You don't have to say it out loud. You don't even have to be right. Just asking it tends to soften the immediate urge to retaliate or withdraw. And that small pause is often where real understanding gets a chance to enter. Carl Jung wrote that everything which irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves, and there's a reason that line keeps getting quoted long after his death. It points at something most people would rather not examine too closely. The behaviors that provoke the strongest reaction in you often share a hidden thread with something unresolved inside your own story. This is uncomfortable precisely because it's true. The colleague who triggers an outsized irritation, the family member whose tone sends you straight back to being 12 years old, these aren't random allergies. They're often pointing, however indirectly, at a wound you haven't fully looked at yet. People who've lived through real difficulty tend to develop this projective empathy almost by accident, because they already know from the inside what it feels like to perform calm while something underneath is anything but. That shared fluency in pain becomes, strangely, a kind of bridge. What makes this skill mature, rather than simply painful, is the moment it stops being only about other people and starts circling back toward the self. Seeing the fear behind someone else's anger is one kind of insight. Recognizing the fear behind your own anger, your own need for control, your own sudden defensiveness, that's a different order of seeing entirely, and it's far less comfortable to practice. This is the threshold most people quietly avoid crossing, because it's one thing to diagnose a friend's defense mechanism from a safe distance, and another thing entirely to catch your own shadow mid-performance and choose to stay present with it instead of looking away. And that threshold, the one between observing other people's wounds and finally turning that same unflinching attention toward your own, is exactly where the next layer of this story has to go, because every pattern you've learned to spot in someone else has almost certainly been quietly repeating itself somewhere in your own life too, just waiting for you to notice the shape it's been wearing all along. Most people experience their life as a series of disconnected events, one relationship ending here, one job falling apart there, each situation feeling, in the moment, like its own isolated story, with its own unique cast of reasons. But step back far enough, the way you'd step back from a painting that only makes sense from across the room, and a different shape starts to emerge. The partners change. The cities change. The specific argument that finally breaks things changes every single time. And yet, somehow, the ending keeps arriving, wearing the exact same face. This is one of the strangest and most disorienting discoveries a person can make about their own life. The realization that what felt like a string of unrelated misfortunes was actually one long pattern, repeating itself in different costumes, waiting patiently to finally be recognized for what it was. Carl Jung put this more sharply than almost anyone before or since. Until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That single idea reframes an enormous amount of human suffering. What looks like bad luck, what looks like always attracting the wrong people or always ending up in the same kind of conflict, is so often not luck at all, but an old, unexamined pattern running on autopilot, choosing familiar outcomes, because familiar, even when it's painful, still feels safer to the nervous system than the genuine unknown. A useful exercise here, one worth actually doing rather than just reading about. Take a blank page and write down your last 3 significant endings. Relationships, jobs, friendships, whatever applies, and underneath each one, write only the feeling you had in the final weeks before it ended. Don't write the story. Don't write who did what. Just the feeling. Read all 3 feelings side by side. More often than people expect, the same word shows up 3 times. There's something almost merciful hidden inside this discovery, even though it rarely feels that way at first. A pattern, once it's actually seen clearly, stops being fate and starts being information. This is the deeper meaning behind individuation, that long, demanding process Jung spent his life describing, the slow work of bringing the unconscious material that's been quietly steering the ship up into the light of conscious awareness, where it can finally be examined instead of simply obeyed. The repetition was never a punishment. It was closer to a message sent over and over because it hadn't been received yet, like a phone ringing in another room that nobody's gotten up to answer. Therapeutic approaches, like schema therapy or even structured journaling, done consistently over months rather than days, exist specifically to help someone trace these loops back to their origin, often a much earlier moment than the adult mind expects. What changes once a person can finally see their own pattern clearly is subtle but enormous. The choice that once felt automatic, the partner who feels intensely familiar, the job that recreates the same dynamic with a different boss, starts to feel less like destiny and more like a fork in the road that's actually visible for the first time. This is the real promise hidden inside the discomfort of recognizing a repeating cycle. The moment you can name it, you've already started to loosen its grip. But naming a pattern and actually stepping outside it are two very different stages of the same journey, and there's a reason the second stage is so much harder than the first. Because seeing the pattern calmly from a safe distance is one thing. The real test arrives in the middle of it, while it's actually happening again. While every instinct is screaming that this time is different, this person is different, this situation doesn't count, and that's exactly the moment that decides whether the cycle finally breaks or simply finds a new disguise to wear next time around. Topic 6. The calm that comes from having already lived through chaos. There's a particular kind of stillness that only shows up in certain people during a crisis, and it tends to confuse everyone watching from the outside. The room is falling apart. Decisions need to be made in seconds, and somehow, this one person isn't shaking. People often mistake this for a personality trait, as if calm were simply something some people were born with and others weren't. But look closer at where that stillness usually comes from, and a different story appears. It isn't the absence of having faced chaos before. It's the opposite. It's a nervous system that already went to the very bottom of something once, maybe more than once, and came back out the other side still breathing. That kind of calm isn't innocence. It's closer to a scar that healed strong enough to stop reacting to smaller cuts the way it used to. Think about what actually happens physiologically when a person experiences something genuinely overwhelming and survives it. The body doesn't just register that the event happened. It registers that it was possible to live through it. That registration becomes a kind of internal reference point, a memory the system can quietly reach for the next time something difficult shows up. This is part of why people who've been through real hardship sometimes seem almost unnervingly steady during a new crisis that would send someone else into a spiral. They're not panicking because some part of them has already done the much harder version of this before. A practical way to actually build this kind of grounded steadiness on purpose, rather than waiting for life to force it on you, is something like cold exposure training, or breath-based stress inoculation, the kind used in programs built around Wim Hof's method, where the body is deliberately introduced to manageable discomfort so the nervous system practices staying regulated under pressure, in a controlled way, before it's ever tested by something it can't control. There's a reason this trait shows up so often in people who've lived through genuine hardship, rather than people who've simply read about resilience in a book. Oprah Winfrey's early life was marked by real instability and hardship, and yet people who've worked closely with her over the years have repeatedly described an almost startling composure in the middle of high-stakes moments. The kind of steadiness that doesn't perform calm, but actually is calm. That composure didn't appear from nowhere. It was built, slowly, the same way muscle is built, through repeated exposure to weight the system eventually learned to carry. This is also where the old idea of being tested by fire stops being just a poetic phrase and starts describing something almost literal. The fire doesn't ask permission, before it arrives. But what it leaves behind, if a person survives it consciously rather than just numbly, is a kind of internal floor that doesn't crack as easily the next time the ground shakes. What's important to understand here, though, is that this isn't about feeling less. People with this kind of earned calm still feel the full weight of a crisis. The fear doesn't disappear. The stakes still register. The difference is that their attention moves toward function instead of freezing. The brain shifts into a kind of working mode rather than a paralysis mode. The way a pilot trained for hundreds of hours in a simulator doesn't stop feeling alarmed when a warning light flashes. They simply already know exactly where their hands need to go next. And this raises a quieter, more personal question worth carrying forward, because calm under external pressure is only half the story. What happens when the chaos isn't coming from a crisis outside, a deadline, an emergency, a sudden loss, but from somewhere with no clear edges at all? The wide-open uncertainty of not knowing what to do next, where there's no fire to survive, just an empty map and the discomfort of having to draw the first line yourself. Most people are trained, almost from childhood, to look for the instructions before starting anything, the recipe, the manual, the proven path someone else has already walked. But there's a different kind of intelligence that develops in people who, for whatever reason, never had that luxury, who had to learn how to move forward in real time, without a finished plan, simply because waiting for perfect conditions wasn't an option available to them. This isn't recklessness. It's a specific kind of resourcefulness that gets built the same way a muscle gets built, through repeated necessity rather than theory. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe captures this almost perfectly. A man stranded with no rescue plan, no map, no certainty of ever being found, who survives not because he has the right answers, but because he keeps generating new ones, day after day, using only what's actually in front of him. What's fascinating about this kind of improvisational intelligence is how closely it's tied to a second trait that seems, at first glance, completely unrelated: the capacity to feel life with unusual intensity. Both of these traits, it turns out, tend to come from the exact same root. When there's no script to follow, attention has nowhere else to go but directly into the present moment, fully, without the cushion of a predetermined outcome to lean back on. A person improvising their way through an unfamiliar forest notices the terrain with a sharpness that someone following a marked trail never has to develop. A practical version of this you can actually practice. The next time you're facing a genuinely uncertain situation, resist the urge to research every possible outcome before acting. Instead, take the smallest next step available, just one. Gather the new information that step reveals, and decide the following step only after that. This is sometimes called acting your way into clarity rather than thinking your way into it. And it's a skill, not a personality trait, which means it can be trained. Carl Jung once wrote that the creation of something new isn't accomplished by the intellect alone, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity, and that idea matters more here than it might first appear. Real creativity rarely emerges from ideal, well-arranged conditions. It tends to emerge under pressure, when the old approach has clearly stopped working, and a new one has to be found simply because there's no other option left. People who've lived through this kind of forced improvisation again and again often develop an unusually flexible relationship with failure, not because failure stops hurting, but because they've already proven to themselves, repeatedly, that one closed door doesn't mean the end of the search. It just means the next question becomes what else is available right now. This same lack of a fixed script is also what allows experience to land with such unusual depth. When nothing is automatic, nothing is taken for granted either. A quiet sunset, an unexpected kindness, a single piece of music can land with a weight that someone moving through life on autopilot simply never accesses. The world stops being neutral background noise and starts becoming something closer to a constant, quiet conversation. And this raises something worth sitting with as this story continues, because feeling everything this intensely, while also constantly improvising your way through uncertainty, eventually creates a strange and very specific inner position, one where a person starts to notice they're not just living their life anymore, they're somehow also watching themselves live it, present in the moment and standing just slightly outside of it at the very same time, and that double position is where the next layer of this entire journey actually begins. There's a particular state of mind that's difficult to describe to someone who's never experienced it, a feeling of fully participating in a moment while some quieter part of the self stands just a few steps back, watching the whole scene unfold, including the part where you're in it. It isn't detachment exactly, and it isn't dissociation in the clinical sense either, though the two can sometimes look similar from the outside. It's closer to occupying two positions in the same room at once, fully inside the conversation, the laughter, the tension, and simultaneously aware of the entire shape of what's happening, the way each person in the room is responding, the unspoken current running underneath the spoken words. People who carry this trait often describe a strange kind of loneliness around it at first, because outwardly everything looks completely normal, while internally there's this constant second channel running, narrating, and observing at the same time. Carl Jung wrote that whoever looks outside dreams, and whoever looks inside awakes, and there's a reason that line tends to land differently, depending on how much a person has actually lived through. The awakening he's pointing at here isn't dramatic or sudden most of the time. It's this quieter shift, where a person starts to notice they're not just swept along by events anymore. They're also watching themselves respond to those events, almost like sitting in a theater and somehow seeing the stage, the audience, and the lighting rig above all at once, instead of just losing yourself in the performance the way everyone around you seems to. A useful practice for working with this consciously, rather than just experiencing it as a strange background hum, is something contemplative traditions have used for centuries in different forms. Sitting in stillness for even 10 minutes and simply noticing thoughts arise without becoming each thought. Treating the mind itself as something you can observe rather than something you simply are. Apps like Waking Up, or even unguided silent sitting, can start building this muscle directly. What makes this observer position so valuable, rather than just strange, is what it makes possible in moments that would otherwise completely overwhelm someone. If part of you is always standing slightly outside the immediate reaction, there's a sliver of space between the trigger and the response, and that sliver is exactly where choice becomes possible instead of automatic reaction. This is part of what separates someone who reacts in the heat of a moment from someone who actually responds. The second person is using that same internal vantage point, that wider awareness, even in the most charged moment, even when emotion is running at full intensity underneath it. The depth and the distance aren't opposites here. They're working together. The depth lets a person feel the moment fully, and the distance lets them not get permanently lost inside it. But this double awareness eventually starts pointing towards something even more important than simply managing reactions well. Because the same observing position that watches a conversation unfold from slightly outside can eventually turn that same lens toward the self as a whole, toward the entire pattern of a life, not just one moment of it. And once that happens, a much bigger and more honest question becomes impossible to avoid any longer. The one underneath everything this whole journey has actually been circling around from the very beginning. All of this perception, this depth, this hard-earned awareness. What is it actually for? Is it simply a survival tool that never got the memo that the danger had passed, quietly keeping someone braced and alert forever? Or is it something else entirely? Something that was always capable of becoming more than the wound that first created it, if only someone finally chose to use it that way. Here's the part of this story that almost never gets said clearly enough, even though it's the part that actually decides everything. The exact same sensitivity, the exact same depth of perception, the exact same hard-earned awareness can lead to two completely different lives. In one version, it becomes a kind of prison. The hypervigilance never turns off. Every relationship gets quietly tested for the betrayal that hasn't happened yet. Every silence gets read as danger, even in rooms that are actually safe. In the other version, that same raw material becomes wisdom. The same sharp perception that once scanned for threats becomes the very thing that allows someone to read a room with compassion, to sense what someone else needs before they can say it themselves, to move through the world with a depth most people never develop. Same starting material, two entirely different destinations. And the fork in that road isn't talent, and it isn't luck. The fork is integration, and integration is a very specific kind of work, different from simply surviving long enough to talk about what happened. Surviving means the pattern is still running the show, just quietly, underneath the surface, still making decisions on autopilot. Integration means that pattern has finally been seen clearly enough, understood deeply enough, that it stops needing to operate in the dark. This is often where real support becomes less of a luxury and more of a necessity. Working with a trauma-informed therapist trained in approaches like EMDR or somatic experiencing tends to create faster, more durable integration than trying to think your way through it alone. Because so much of what needs to shift lives below the level thinking can actually reach. There's no shame in that. The body that learned to survive without anyone's help is allowed to finally get some. Carl Jung's idea of wholeness is worth returning to here directly, because he was specific about something most self-help language quietly gets wrong. Wholeness isn't achieved by cutting off the difficult parts of yourself, the hypervigilance, the old fear, the sharp edges that pain carved into you. It's achieved by integrating them, bringing them into conscious relationship with the rest of who you are, instead of either drowning in them or pretending they don't exist. A person who's done this work doesn't lose their depth of perception, their ability to read a room, their sensitivity to the unspoken. They simply stop being run by it. The radar stays online. It just stops mistaking every room for the one that hurt them years ago. This is the actual turning point this whole journey has been building toward, and it deserves to be said plainly instead of left implied. The wound is not the end of the story, and it never had to be the entire story either. What happens next depends almost entirely on whether that wound gets carried in silence, repeating itself in new disguises forever, or whether it finally gets looked at directly, named, understood, and folded into a larger, more whole sense of who someone actually is. That choice is rarely made once and finished. It's made over and over, in small moments, every time the old pattern flares up and a person decides, again, to meet it with awareness instead of letting it run the show one more time. And that ongoing choice, repeated enough times, is exactly what starts shaping the final chapter of this entire story. The one where the wound stops being something a person merely survived and finally becomes something they actually understand. There's an old image from the blacksmith's forge that captures something words alone struggle to explain. Metal doesn't become a blade by avoiding the fire. It becomes a blade by passing through it, again and again, each pass changing its internal structure a little more, until what was once soft and shapeless becomes something with an edge, something with form, something that holds. Left in the flames forever, the same metal would simply burn away into nothing. But shaped correctly, the very fire that could have destroyed it becomes the exact force that gives it strength. A human life carrying real pain follows something close to this same pattern. Not because suffering is good, and not because anyone should go looking for it, but because once it's already happened. What gets done with it afterward makes all the difference between a life that stays bent around an old injury and a life that grows into something with real shape and real depth. This is the deeper meaning underneath individuation, that long, demanding process of becoming a whole person rather than a fragmented collection of defenses and old reactions. It was never about erasing the past, pretending the difficult chapters didn't happen, performing a kind of forced positivity that just buries the wound under a thinner layer of denial. It was always about bringing every part of that story into conscious awareness. The fear, the hypervigilance, the old patterns, the sharpened perception, and letting all of it finally take its place as part of a larger whole instead of operating as a hidden, separate system running in the background of an entire life. When that actually happens, something shifts in a way that's hard to fake and impossible to miss from the inside. The same depth that once felt like a burden starts feeling like a kind of vision. The same vigilance that once felt exhausting starts feeling like discernment. Nothing about the original pain gets minimized. It simply stops being the only thing doing the talking. So here's the real question this entire journey has been quietly building toward, the one worth actually sitting with instead of rushing past. What is the pattern in your own life that keeps showing up in different costumes, waiting for you to finally recognize its face? What is the reaction that feels automatic, the one that arrives faster than thought, that might actually be tracing back to something much older than the situation in front of you right now? These aren't questions with comfortable answers most of the time, and they're not supposed to be. They're the kind of questions that, once actually asked with honesty instead of avoided, start the real work of turning a wound into something with form, something with weight, something that finally belongs to you instead of secretly running you. If any part of this found you today, if something in here named a feeling you've carried for years without quite having the language for it, that's not a coincidence. That's recognition. And recognition is always the first real step toward change. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this is exactly the kind of work that deserves to be walked slowly, one layer at a time, together. And there's a great deal more of this journey still ahead.